Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Politics Show. Today, I'm here with Dr. Elena Stavreska. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Would you be able to provide both myself and the audience with a little bit of what you do?
Yes, so I am currently a research officer at the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the London School of Economics and Political Science. My work primarily is focused on conflict-affected societies and specifically aspects of intersectionality and political economy, as well as gender, obviously. You cannot talk about intersectionality without gender. And empirically, I have so far focused primarily on Bosnia and Herzegovina and Colombia.
Okay. So I was introduced to you at first when I was learning about feminist approaches in one of my courses at Quinnipiac University. Do you consider yourself a feminist? And if so, there's a connotation that exists within the word itself. Some find it on the extreme right to find it to mean female supremacism, whereas others consider women to be equitable when women, particularly in the United States, were given the right to vote. Would you be able to clarify this meaning?
Yeah, sure, of course. And actually, in a lot of my work in the field, quote unquote, in Bosnia and Colombia, a lot of women activists would actually say that they're not feminists for different reasons than those on the right. Feminism basically means having an option. And it's not only about women, it's equally about men and non-binary people. It is about having an option to choose, to make your life choices. In other words, having the option to choose to have children or not have children, to share responsibility in the household, choosing, for instance, to have a career and children at the same time. So in the larger scheme of things, that's what it means. It means that men can cry. So it means that moving beyond the boxes of what a man or woman should, quote unquote, do or act like. So it is about unpacking this concept of gender, which is a social construct, and freeing everyone, so to say. So if someone chooses to not have a family, as I said, or have a family, both of those choices should be valid, which ties into the point that I just made about some of the people I work with in Colombia, for instance, some of the women peace builders saying that they're not feminists, because in certain contexts, feminism is associated with liberal feminism specifically, which is also against, I mean, not always, but sometimes has been against this idea of the nuclear family, right? And sees the family as an oppressive structure in and of itself. But then we also have to take into consideration that in certain contexts, for instance, post-slavery, post-genocide, post-war, post any system that has operated, among other things, on the notion of keeping families apart, keeping a family together is actually a resistive act almost, right? So we have to understand equally feminism not as one that is the same for everyone, but one that narrows down, that goes back to the context. So feminism means different things in different contexts, but at the most general level, it means having a choice.
Okay, and would you say that also the having a choice aspect also applies to gender theory and equity?
Yes, of course it does, because I mean we have this false notion of separation between the political and the economic, for instance. But at the same time, if you think about it, even in the US, for instance, in order to be able to vote, you have to be able to afford to vote. In the US, elections are not held on a non-working day, which means that a person who has to work 3 jobs to supply for their family will not be able to vote. So the economic and the political are very closely tied. So in that sense is that, and I think the personal is also political, not me, just every feminist would say that the personal is also political. So then the equity is has to be both political and economic. And unless there is equity, then there will be no grounds for making a choice. So for instance, if you're born into oppressive structures, be that racist structures or patriarchal societies and so on, the spectrum of choices is very limited. And it's limited both because these structures work together, right? Capitalism and racism and patriarchy, they work together and they feed off each other. So in that sense, being born, and all of us are unfortunately born within these systems, being born in those systems limit the spectrum of choices you have. So unless we dismantle those systems, the choices will always be limited. And so for some people, this is much more. So for instance, some of the Roma women that I have worked with in Bosnia, so they are both the poorest minority, oppressed by all sides on multiple levels. They are a racialized minority as well. And then women are also expected to perform certain things, not to necessarily get education, not to work, and so on. So that further limits the scope of possibilities for them. While for other women in Bosnia, that would be different. So depending on where you are in these structures, but we are all in those structures, the choices will vary. So therefore, equity would mean more people or everyone having a full spectrum of possibilities, a full spectrum of choices.
So perhaps this is a rather deep question, but why do you believe those structures exist?
Oh, it is a deep question, but it's also a question that we've all thought about quite a bit, because we see, I mean, actually Cynthia Enloe, who's one of the founders of the field of feminist international relations, recently, last year already, but time is a bit blurry right now, at a lecture asked, why is it sustained? How is it sustained? There's so many people who raise their voices against. But the thing is that these structures, as I said, feed off each other. And second, the status quo has always been much more easier to maintain than to dismantle. It's just a simple, even a physics rule, right? If a ball is moving down the road, it's harder to stop it than to let it continue, right? So why they persist? I think that there's a lot of people in powerful positions that benefit from these structures, including, so I'm talking politicians, people who sponsor and fund the campaigns of politicians, companies and corporations that fit into that as well. So there's a lot of people who make the decisions ultimately, who benefit from the status quo, from things remaining as they are. And as you know, a lot of theorists and activists would say, the silent minority does not have the resources to actually necessarily fight that, and sometimes not even the willingness, because people are afraid. I mean, in different systems, obviously, differently. And the other thing is that sometimes, because just like, say, colonialism, it is a thing of the mind as well. It's not just a material thing. So similarly, patriarchy is a thing that is a patriarchy of the mind as well, as is capitalism, as is racism. So it's also about educating enough people that a different world is possible, and creating alternatives that, you know, that can be brought closer to the people.
So you believe it's a combination of factors: the capitalist hegemony, basically the male-dominated society, the masculine society.
Not just the male-dominated, because it's not the men who are the problem. It's the patriarchy that's the problem.
Okay.
And I think this is a very important distinction, because there are a lot of women we've seen. I mean, I am currently in the UK, where Margaret Thatcher has done more to roll back women's rights, not women's rights, women's economic well-being, not just women's, everyone's economic well-being, but including women, than some other prime ministers. So it's not an issue of men versus women. It's an issue of the patriarchy as well. It is true that it's mainly men who benefit, but it's not all men that benefit from the patriarchy either. So yeah, I do think that the issue is, as I said, these things, I mean, I don't think racism would exist in the form it does without capitalism, without neoliberal capitalism specifically, because and similarly with patriarchy, because, for instance, capitalism is, among other things, exploiting different layers of the society, and you cannot exploit people unless there's other systems as well who tell them that they have lesser value than other.
Is there a particular thing that drew you to feel this study as opposed to another field of study?
Well, conflict affected societies. I was born in Yugoslavia, and I lived through the wars in Yugoslavia. So a question that I always asked since I was a kid was, why do people fight? I mean, I still don't have an answer to that necessarily, but what does it take for one person to pick up a weapon and try to kill other people, right? And then, I mean, I was raised in many ways in a feminist society, family, where I was led to believe until I met the world, that I could make my own choices. And so seeing, I mean, so for instance, my grandmother was not allowed to go to school. My mom was the first girl from her village to go to university. And then there was a lot of revolt within the village because a woman was allowed to go to university. So in a way, I've always been aware of things, of people being held down, and women in particular. But then as I started exploring more and more about the wars in Yugoslavia, as I started researching this, I was particularly curious of what happens to people who are not just not around the table, but people who are rendered invisible by all the policies. And this is sometimes women, but often is minority women in particular, right? Because when you count heads and you invite minorities to the table for a tokenism most of the time, you would usually invite a man. You would not invite a woman unless it's something specific. But this is also very rare. So that's what it was, a mixture. Yeah, I guess actually primarily personal background that drew me, which is also what makes me very passionate about this work.
Okay, so I kind of want to shift the conversation to talking the actual study of international relations. You know, typically when most people talk about feminism and gender, they talk about it in domestic terms: voting rights, abortion, wage gap, and specifically in the United States, the lack of paid maternity leave. Yet those are values of femininity and gender should be discussed in foreign affairs. Can you explain?
Well, yes, because I think the domestic and the domestic and the international are very connected. So for instance, there's something called the Women, Peace and Security Agenda at the UN Security Council. This consists of 10 different resolutions. We've seen that in the last, and they haven't been progressive necessarily, nor feminist for that matter, but they have been a huge step as far as the UN Security Council goes. So this year we celebrate 20 years since the first resolution, and they have specifically focused on women in conflict-affected societies. However, and then those resolutions are expected to be translated to something called national action plans, which is interesting because in most of the global North countries, these national action plans, even though they might have women struggling within the country, they're very outward looking. It's about the violence being imagined out there. However, we're all connected in a system that cannot, I mean, you know, as I said in the lecture for Marcus's class, the veterans that are on the street, that are homeless, that are on the streets of the US are the ones that have fought the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo, for instance. Not always, but sometimes, or Iraq or Afghanistan, it doesn't matter. But these are connected issues, so you cannot resolve things. And similarly, so for instance, going into Afghanistan was largely, if you remember, was largely discursively framed around women's rights, saving the Afghan women. But then a lot of the Afghan women were killed by the same weapons that were brought to the country. And at the same time, there's a lot of women in the US that have not been saved, whatever saved might mean. Because women don't necessarily need saviors, they need structures that can support them. So in many ways, the domestic, as I said, is connected to the international. And to give you one more example, so in 2019, there were 2 resolutions that were added to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda at the UN Security Council. And the one that was adopted in April of last year had stronger protections of reproductive health for women and girls who are victims of sexual violence around the world. The Trump administration insisted on rolling that back because they saw it as a potential backdoor to abortion rights within the US. so it's obvious that politicians see the connection between the domestic and the international. So there's no reason for us to separate the two. We always have to think of how can, it's not about how can certain layer of women rely on other layers of women, but how can everyone be lifted?
So it's interesting that you brought up the UN in particular, because that is a great segue into my next question. Some particularly liberal feminists would argue that if you put more women onto these positions of power in the UN, let's say, that would remedy the problem of women getting harmed by this patriarchal policy. Do you believe better representation works, or do we need to go further than that?
No, yeah, I mean, yes and no. Representation is important because it expands our imaginary of what's possible, right? You probably know that joke. I mean, it's not a joke; it's an anecdote about a boy being brought into the ER together with his father, and then the doctor says, "I cannot operate on this boy. He is my son." When asked, "How was this possible?" most people are likely to guess that it's a gay couple than assuming that the surgeon might be a woman. This is in a particular context, but the point is that our imaginary of what's possible, of who can be a president, of who can sit on the Security Council and so on, that's important. But that in and of itself is symbolic, because not all women are feminists, as I said, and it doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, we have seen Secretary of States, we have seen prominent women in the U.S. politics that have been far from feminist, and feminist for all. I mean, in the genuine sense of the word feminist. So as I said, yes and no. Nancy Fraser has this nice idea of what the justice or equity might mean, and she unpacks it in 3 layers. One is representation. The other one is recognition that there are specific needs that certain groups within the society might have that are different than others. And then she also talks about redistribution, or basically the material base for creating opportunities. So representation itself is not enough. That said, I think it's also 2 things are equally important here. One is representation of whom. It's not just a woman being there, but who does that woman represent? So for instance, a study of women at peace negotiations has found that women who are supported by NGOs, by civil society, and are held responsible by civil society have more of a say, and their contribution is more taken into account in drafting the final peace agreement than women who might be brought on by the warring parties or someone else. The second thing that I wanted to bring up here is that the representation of women is also important, because then some things become visible, some issues and some needs that otherwise would not even have been thought of unless a woman is at the table, might be brought on, but it's not a guarantee. So yes and no, representation is good and it's important, but it's not enough.
So with this concept of representation, some would argue that when you have these, let's say, quotas per se, that you need to have a certain number of women, that eliminates qualified people from sitting at the table. What would you say to those people who would say that?
This question is always brought up when we talk about women and people of color. It's never brought up about men. I've never heard it brought up about men. I don't know where the assumption of not being qualified comes. I mean, most people that I have known that have been in competition over a certain position, where it's been like, who should get hired, have been overqualified even, not just qualified. So no, I don't think it's an actual genuine concern, because in my experience, I have never known a lesser qualified candidate to be hired just for the purposes of diversity, quote unquote, just for the purposes of increasing representation. There are plenty of qualified candidates for all sorts of positions out there. And I think it's often a matter of willingness, but also recognizing the biases that come with the embeddedness of the patriarchy and the racial and other oppressive systems that exist. So for instance, when we ask the question of, you know how a woman is bossy and a man is is a leader. So like some of these things that we assume how one should behave on the basis of their gender, on the basis of their race, and so on, age, and so on. So it's more about checking our biases and thinking more broadly than a matter of putting unqualified people in places with power.
So you believe it stems, so you don't believe it's a genuine concern. Where do you think those calls for quotas originated from if you don't believe it's like a genuine?
They originate in recognizing the systems that do keep people down. I mean, quotas are needed, but quotas were never intended, and they never are implemented that way as advancing someone just for the sake of having one person there. I mean, some people actually do this, but that's tokenism right there. But it is about recognizing the structures that drive the selection process, but also the structures that are keeping us down from reaching certain levels. For instance, we know who can go to Ivy League schools. We know who even knows about the existence of Ivy League schools. And when you look at, I mean, no disrespect to the students who go there, but if you look at the people who've graduated from these schools, it's very clear what the background is and what the trajectory even is, right? So it's about recognizing historically and also in the moment how these different structures have affected the growth of people.
Okay. I want to move on to talking about the ramifications of particularly United States policy in other countries, and how it affects gender and how it affects women in other countries. And I always go to the example of Iraqi civilians where, hundreds of thousands were killed. However, that's a general statement about people as a whole being harmed. Are there instances where U.S. foreign policy perhaps purposefully or inadvertently targets women?
Targets negatively, you mean, or positively?
Either.
There are, because you have a lot of different programs through different UN agencies or the embassies as well that are specifically focused on women. But these are also of a particular type. They're not necessarily about changing the policy as a whole or changing the structures, as I keep saying. They might be about economic empowerment in a very narrow sense. Let's create more women business owners. This is not bad in and of itself. It just perpetuates a certain system that the US is promoting globally. So it's not, I mean, that said, there have been countries where US foreign policy, and I'm not talking just about Trump, I'm talking historically, have been detrimental to women. This includes a lot of Latin America. This includes plenty of the Middle East, because if you see the unraveling of the Middle East that has come after the 2003 invasion of Iraq, has very negatively affected women. It has affected others as well. Then all the advances that were done towards women's rights in Afghanistan, with the talk of having peace talks with the Taliban, are just gone. To say nothing of what's happening in Yemen, to say nothing of all the instances where the US has decided not to intervene. I mean, there's been instances when it's been terrible that they have intervened, but there are also instances where they've decided not to intervene. The other thing is that women are in conflicts, and the US has had quite a few of those. In conflicts, women are affected in a particular way. So it's not necessarily a policy. I'm not sure. I don't think anyone in the State Department has sat around the table and said, let's target women here. But women are, the awareness of this has to be there, that women are disproportionately affected by wars in a specific way as well. And I have not seen enough of an effort to even roll back those negative consequences, let alone to advance past that.
Okay. Well,
sorry, now it sounds like I'm just criticizing the US, but there's plenty to be criticized in US foreign policy.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree. We can talk about criticizing U.S. foreign policy for hours.
Yes, we
But
can.
no, I appreciate you coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Do you have anything last thing you'd like to say about this move, about the ideology itself?
uh no, it's just that, when people ask me, are you a feminist, I usually ask, are you not? Because the opposite of not being a feminist is believing that some people should have more rights than others and some people do not deserve to be equal to others, which in and of itself is a problematic concept. And it shouldn't be me who's, as a feminist, that should be ashamed of being a feminist. It should be the other person who's not a feminist who should reconsider their view. But other than that, I just want to thank you for having me on the show, and thank you for doing this, for this initiative. And I hope those listening will have a good time. I had a good time talking to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.